You know, there's a gospel saying, which is, of course, impossible to comprehend or believe. Knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. And people think, well, no way, the world's not constituted like that. It's like, it goes back to the idea of aim. If you don't aim at it, you're not going to hit it. And you know, it might also go back to a question about what do you mean by ask and what do you mean by want? Because it isn't just some casual request. You know, you're praying to God, I wish I could find my wallet or something like that, as if he's the casual granter of magical wishes, like a fairy with a magic wand. You know, it's not that. Asking means something like this: I am willing to give up everything that I'm doing wrong so that I can put things right, if I could know what right was. And that's you're on your knees when you say that, man. And maybe if you're on your knees, you get the answer. And so that's what we're thinking about. So, you know, if you knocked and you wanted to walk through and you asked and you wanted to learn, you know, and you sought because you wanted to find, maybe you would receive and be answered and find, but not without aim.
Need motivation?
Watch the Top 10 with Believe Nation.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle, but you know you're capable of more. And you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Jordan Peterson, and my take on his top 10 rules of success. Enjoy. Rule number 2, protect your beliefs.
If you don't have some notion of the divine, then you'll believe any damn thing.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's right.
And that's what the kids are doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, Dostoevsky's comment on that was, if there's no God, everything is permitted. You know, and he did a lovely job of analyzing that in Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. And I think it's true. I think if you believe nothing, you'll fall for anything. And I really do believe that's the case. And, you know, you might say, well, what do you mean? You mentioned earlier that people like to ask me if I believe in God. And I always think, well, who are you to be asking that question? First of all, you have some notion of what you mean by believe that you think is just accurate because you know what believe means. And so you have a priori theory about belief. And now you're asking me if my belief in God fits into your a priori theory. It's how about we start by questioning your a priori theory of belief? Because I don't even know what you mean by believe, and neither do you. Especially when we're asking a question that profound. Because, you know, do you believe in God? There's two mysteries there. Well, three. You believe God. All three of those are subject to question. I think people act out what they believe. And so when people ask me if I believe in God, I say generally that I act as if God exists, or I try to act as if God exists. And they're not very happy about that because they want me to abide by the implicit rules of their question, which is, no, do you believe in the religious view as a pseudoscientific description of the structure of reality? It's like, well, I don't even know how to answer that question because it's so badly formulated, I can't get a handle on it. Do you believe that there's something divine? Well, let's try to define divine. Here, we can do that for a moment. Most of us have some sense that literary stories differ in their depth. I don't think that's an unwarranted proposition. Some stories are shallow and some stories are deep. Some stories are ephemeral and some move you deeply. Whatever that means, it's a metaphor, but we understand what it means. Imagine there are layers of literary depth. And one way of conceptualizing the layers of literary depth is that the deeper an idea is, the more other ideas depend on it. Right? And so you have fundamental ideas that are fundamental because if you shake that idea, you shake all the ideas that are dependent on them. And then I would say, well, the realm of the divine is the realm of the most fundamental ideas. And you don't get to believe in that or not, because the alternative is to say, well, all ideas are equal in value. It's like, okay, well, try acting then. And you can't, because you can't act unless you prioritize your beliefs. And if you prioritize them, you arrange them into a hierarchy. And if you arrange them into a hierarchy, you accept the notion of depth. And so that's a no-go. When we use language of the divine, we're talking about the deepest ideas. And so I believe that the notion that each individual is characterized by a consciousness that transforms the horizon of the future into the present, that's a divine idea. It's so deep. And our cultures necessarily, I think functional cultures are necessarily predicated on that idea. So I don't just think it's a Western idea. I don't think you can have a functional culture that in some sense doesn't instantiate that idea, because you interfere with the mechanism of adaptation itself by not allowing it free expression. You know, and you can be like my prime minister and you can say, well, I really admire the Chinese Communist Party because when it comes to environmental issues, they get things done. And I think, I couldn't begin to tell you how many things are wrong with that statement. It would take like 15 years to tell you why you're an inexcusably narcissistic idiot. But we can start like simply. If you know what you're doing and you have power, if you know what you're doing, maybe you can be more efficient in your exercise in your control over movement towards that goal. Let's just assume for a minute that you do know what you're doing. Well, maybe if you have power, then you're efficient. Fair enough, man. What about when you don't know what you're doing? How about then? Where do you turn? Because what that means is your ideology failed you. And do you have a mechanism for operating when you don't know what you're doing? Well, no, because we always know what we're doing because we're totalitarian and we have a complete theory of everything. And don't say anything to the contrary or else. We've got it all wrapped up. Yeah, except when you don't. And so what do we do in free societies when we don't know what we're doing? Well, we let people talk. And out of that babble, out of that noise, and American culture is particularly remarkable in this regard, you have this immense diversity of opinions, most of which are completely useless, and some of which are absolutely redemptive. And one of the things that's so remarkable as a Canadian observing your culture in particular is that, you know, you guys veer off in weird directions fairly frequently and things look pretty unstable, and then there's some glimmer of hope somewhere that bursts forward in a whole new mode of adaptation, and away you go again. And that just happens over and over and over. And that's a consequence of real diversity. And it's definitely a consequence of like freedom of association and freedom of speech, because it enables all that.
Rule number 3, win over temptations.
You're at a crossroads, right? You're entering a new phase of your life. You're someone different than you were 4 years ago. And hopefully someone better, likely someone better. And you have another opportunity now to be the next iteration of yourself that you can be. At a crossroads, you know, the metaphor works because you make a decision. You go one direction or another. And there's an old blues idea that you meet the devil at the crossroads. I always wondered why that was. I thought it through. It's a really compelling idea. You know, it's an image that has a good narrative fit and it sticks in your memory once you hear it. Why do you meet the devil at the crossroads at midnight? Maybe that's when you examine your conscience, or it examines you. And then you might ask, well, why do you meet the devil at the crossroads? And the answer is, most fundamentally, because when you come to a place in your life where you have to make a choice, and I think this is actually true of every choice we ever make, but it's more evident when the choice is more weighty, let's say, as the choices that lay themselves out now in front of you are weighty. You aim up or down. And there is always an agent of temptation at every choice point enticing you to aim down. And I've thought a lot about what aiming down means, and so I'll run through that for a bit. The spirit of temptation, it manifests itself, for example, in the story of Cain and Abel. And so Cain falls prey to temptation, and God bluntly informs him when he complains about his fate that the temptation was freely chosen and that he could have done differently and better. And Cain becomes... This is in the aftermath of the improper sacrifices that he makes. The sacrifices that he makes that are not everything they could be. They're not in the service of the highest good, that are deceptive and arrogant simultaneously, because when we make improper sacrifices, we believe in the deepest part of ourselves that we've pulled one over God. And I suggest that that's a temptation you might want to avoid, that presumption. And then you might say, well, if you're tempted to aim down, you're tempted to make improper sacrifices, you're tempted to arrogantly presume that you are going to get away from it, with it, that you're not going to be called on it, what are the pathways down that might manifest themselves in front of you? And I think the two stories that follow the story of Cain and Abel detail that. So after Cain and Abel comes the flood. And that's no accident. The narrative placement of those stories is definitely no accident. It's unbelievably sophisticated from a literary perspective, a philosophical perspective, theological perspective, existential perspective. One form of temptation is the nihilistic chaos that's symbolically represented by the flood, right? It's the proliferation of sins. And sin is a word, both its Greek and its Hebrew derivation are related to archery. So the Greek derivation, I hope I haven't got this wrong because I know there are Greek scholars in this audience. So the word is derived from the Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark, and it's an archery term. It's a lovely notion to know that, because to sin therefore means to miss the target, which implies that it has something to do with aim or the lack thereof. I love that. I think it's so apt. And the derivation of the word sin from the Hebrew source actually relies on the same imagery. And so to sin is to aim wrong or to miss the mark. And there's a variety of ways you can miss the mark, right? Don't aim at all. That's a good one. Assume there is no such thing as aim. Assume all aims are equal. Well, you sin, you miss the mark. What can happen? Well, one way is you can descend into a kind of nihilistic hopelessness. And that's not... You can understand that. You know, you meet people in life whose lives have been so hard. You hear their stories. They've suffered so much, and they're bitter, and they're hurt, and they're resentful. And you think, oh my God, it's no wonder you're bitter and hurt and resentful. I mean, look what you've gone through. But you also notice that their bitterness and their resentment and their hopelessness and their chaos and their anxiety, it's not helping, right? It's worsening the problem. It's not making it better. And I'm not saying that people can always resist that. But I've certainly seen that it's not helpful. But I've also met other people, you know, who have had stories equally catastrophic, sometimes more catastrophic, sometimes so catastrophic you can't even believe that they survived, who are not embittered or made resentful by those experiences, and who continue to aim up. And so that makes a mockery of a kind of casual determinism, right? Is that you end up chaotic, nihilistic, hopeless, anxious, etc., merely as a consequence of the unbearable tragedy of your life. Because if that was the case, then everyone who had a series of unbearable tragedies, which, by the way, will be almost all of us in one way or another at one time or another, would end up in that catastrophic chaos that if manifested broadly enough in a society, produces a flood that ends everything. And that's the story of Noah in large part. And Noah, you know, he's wise in his generations was a lovely phrase, because it means for his time and place he was a good man. And that's a lens through which history might well be viewed. You know, we're very presumptuous, us moderns. We look back and we think, well, you know, this person who did all these remarkable things said these things that we now regard as inappropriate and therefore can be dispensed with. It's like, well, what makes you think that you're above that criticism 100 years from now, that, you know, the best you can do is to be as good as you can in your time and place. And if you can manage that, well, good for you. If you can transcend that, well, then maybe you're some sort of saint, and you're probably not. So aiming at just the first is not such a bad upper aim.
Rule number 4, learn true self-awareness.
First of all, I do believe that I don't think science is possible outside of an encompassing Judeo-Christian ethic. So, for example, I don't think you can be a scientist without believing as an axiom of faith that truth will set you free, or that will set us free. So we don't know the conditions under which science is possible, you know, and we tend to overestimate its epistemological potency. It's only been around, I mean, you can stretch it back to the Greeks if you're inclined, but in a formal sense, it's only been around for about 5 centuries, and it's only thrived for a very short period of time. And it's perfectly reasonable to assume that there were particular preconditions that made its rise and ascendancy possible.
It is a historical phenomenon.
Yes.
It happened at a specific moment in time.
Right, and at least
So
in
you say,
principle
what are the
for particular
conditions?
reasons. Yeah, and I think one of the conditions, well, there's a bunch of them. One is, for example, there's an intense insistence in the Christian tradition that the mind of God in some sense is knowable.
Yes.
So we could say, well, the structure of the cosmos, and you have to believe that that's the case before you're going to embark on a scientific endeavor. You have to believe that there's some relationship between logos, logic, let's say, but logos is a much broader concept than logic, that's for sure. You have to believe that there's some relationship between that and the structure of the cosmos. You have to believe that the pursuit of truth is in itself an ethical good, because why would you otherwise bother? You have to believe that there is such a thing as an ethical good, and those are not scientific questions, which is why I think the arguments of people like Hitchens are weak. It's like, yeah, Hitchens, Dawkins, people like that, they have a metaphysic, which they don't know, and they assume that metaphysic is self-evident. It's like, well, sorry guys, it's actually not self-evident, and they assume that it can be derived from the observations of empirical reality, and the answer to that is no, there's going to be axioms of your perceptual system that aren't derivable from the contents of your perceptual system. And you might think, well, that's not very scientific, and I would say, well, take it up with Roger Penrose and see what he thinks. Because I just talked to him for like 3 hours partly about this topic, about, say, the role of consciousness and the structure of consciousness, and it's by no means obvious that the materialist reductionists have the correct theory about the nature of consciousness. And not surprisingly, it's like we don't understand the relationship between consciousness and being at all. And so
These are hard questions.
well, they're the hard question for consciousness researchers is why is there consciousness, rather than why aren't we just unconscious mechanisms acting deterministically? They call that the hard question. I don't think that is the hard question. I think the hard question is what's the relationship between consciousness and being itself? And because I can't understand what it means for something to be in the absence of some awareness of that being. So when we say being, there's an awareness component implicit in the idea of being itself. So consciousness is integrally tied up with being in some mysterious manner. And I also don't believe that the most sophisticated scientists are by necessity reductionist materialists. Like, get as far as you can with that, no problem. It's Occam's razor clear. If you can reduce and account deterministically, no problem. But don't be thinking that accounts for everything, because I don't think there's any evidence that it does.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5, develop moral consciousness.
So imagine that you're in Amsterdam during World War II and the Nazis are everywhere, and you have a Jewish family in the attic, and you're up there with a baby, and there's 25 Nazi officers on the ground floor, and the baby starts to cry. Do you smother the baby? You save all the people upstairs. And Claire, who was a mother of a very young child at that time, said her response was, "Don't ask me such stupid questions," which I think is actually the right response. And it's more embodied response, right? And you can trap your philosophical cognition into weird corners, but that doesn't mean that your fundamental intuitions are flawed.
Yeah, this is right.
With this Nozick thing, it's like, well, if you could not have a body, it's like, yeah, no. You know, you're grounded out in the world.
That's the rejection of Derek Parfit, right? So Derek Parfit's entire moral theory is the trolley problems, and you can decide how morality is constructed based on trolley problems, and people are like, well, that's not really how morality is constructed. It's not all based on edge cases,
it's right? Not really how it's constructed at all. It has to be embodied, for example, and that's a crucial issue. You know, and so the notion that a set of semantic philosophical propositions, even coherently organized, constitutes the ethical world, and that ethics is top down from the semantic space into the embodied space. There's some truth in that, because there's feedback loops, right? We think about ethics, and we can move around the edges of ethics and so forth, but it's within a game that's already established. And that game is actually established through embodied negotiation first. So when you see Moses leading his people through the desert, they're all fighting and scrapping away, right? And then he sits as judge of them for a very long period of time. It's months or years even, so much that his father-in-law says, you have to stop doing this because it's exhausting you, right? It's after that he receives the revelations from on high. And so my sense of that psychologically is it's a story about the fact that morality is encoded in our behavior in a deep level. And so deep we actually don't understand the morality. But then now and then we get an imaginative insight into the moral pattern. And then we get a semantic representation of the imaginative insight, and that's this revelation. It's like, here's a moral rule. It's like wolves suddenly becoming semantically conscious of the authority relationships in their pack.
Oh, that's really good. I like that a lot. That's quite good.
Like 20 years to pick up, so put a lot of effort into that.
Yeah, no, there's a big kind of rich debate in Jewish philosophy over whether Moses is right to listen to Jethro. So Jethro comes in and says, you need to devolve authority to lower levels. You need the princes, you need the judges of the tens, and then the judges of the hundreds.
Yeah, which is a lovely way of thinking about it too, because they parse out I thought that's what should have happened in Iraq, right? Kill the tyranny. Well, what do? You have to establish a hierarchical local authority.
Yeah, exactly. So Jethro,
centralized control doesn't work.
But one of the big questions is whether, in doing that, is Moses setting the stage for all of the chaos that follows? Because once you give up the authority that he has, the direct authority, and you have now layers of authority below him, how much authority can you devolve to layers below you without giving up the prime authority at the top? Right?
That is like one of the cardinal questions of life, isn't it? You know, if you have a family, you want to devolve authority and facilitate autonomy. And the question is, how much can you do that without generating disunity? And I would say it depends on the value of the goal that unites you. And then that brings up another question, and this is a question I would say for the moral relativists. I was talking to Rupert Sheldrake in Cambridge. He has lots of wild ideas, but I was conducting a seminar there on the nature of the uniting ideal. So it was imitation of the divine ideal. So you need a higher order aim to unite subordinate drives. Right? So the question then is, what becomes the highest order ethic?
Right.
It's like the pyramid with a gold cap on the top, or the Washington Monument with a pyramid on top of it with this aluminum cap on. Something's at the top, and the thing that's at the top is actually qualitatively distinctive from all the things that are subordinate to it. So the question is, well, what's that highest order uniting principle? And, well, one answer to that the three religions that are based on books have proposed is it has something to do with the authority of the word. And Christianity, that's developed into the notion of the divine word. And you see that saturating Judaism as well. And that's at least in part because the thing that has to be superordinate is freedom of, it's not freedom of thought exactly, it's more like freedom of consciousness, because logos isn't thought. It's not logic either. It's much broader than that. It's more like consciousness itself. And the reason I think that's true technically is because imagine that consciousness and attention are in some sense isomorphic, right? I mean, when we pay attention to something, we become conscious of it.
Okay.
Consciousness is the mechanism that generates proximal solutions and dissolves and regenerates them. And so all the proximal solutions have to be made subordinate to respect for the process that generates all the...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
I think it's a cardinal presupposition of psychotherapy, because what you do in psychotherapy is you allow people maximal freedom of expression, right? You don't impose your views on them. Even the Freudians used free association. Say whatever comes into your mind, and it turns out that that process of untrammeled expression in good faith is actually curative. It actually makes people better. It leads them to what they're afraid of. That's one of the consequences of free speech, right? Because you tend to circulate around what bothers you and what disturbs you, and so untrammeled freedom of expression will lead you to the source of your fears, and then you can confront those fears, and then in confronting them you can get more courageous. That's all part of it.
Rule number 6, be a better storyteller.
The other thing that ideology does, and the radical leftists are also very good at this, is that it provides you with a convenient locale for the for the existence of evil. And so if you reflexively identify the patriarchy with evil, well, first of all, that's a powerful idea. It independent of its broad merit. It's true. Now, it's not the only truth and it's not the complete truth, but it's true. The reason it's true is because every hierarchical system tends to degenerate in the direction of power. And all hierarchical systems are less than they could be. And that's partly because of the possibility that power and deceit will corrupt them, but also partly because we're willfully blind and deceitful in our own personal lives. And so when you tell young people that the cause of the trouble they see around them in the world, and maybe even the disquiet in their own heart, is the malevolent inadequacy of their society, that rings true. And they don't hear the rest of the story, and it's the rest of the story that I've been trying to tell. They don't hear the story that, don't forget about the evil and corruption that exists in your own heart. And don't forget about the fact that nature, this wondrous goddess as portrayed by the anti-human environmentalists, and by that I don't mean all environmentalists, by the way, that wonderful goddess nature is also trying to make you ill and kill you at all times. And so, but the story that corruption exists in hierarchical structure and that's a consequence of malevolence, the malevolent use of power and deceit, that's true. So it's very motivating, especially if you're young and you're looking for an adventure. Now, it's also too convenient, which is one of its tremendous dangers, because unless you're taught to look within and identify the malevolence there as the primary moral obligation, then you now have an excuse and a moral justification to take out all of your negative emotion, your hostility, your resentment, everything about you that's unexamined on the demonic enemy. And of course, that degenerates with extraordinary rapidity, as we've seen over and over and over. So it's up to the centrists on both sides to deal with this. I've been talking to a lot of the optimist rationalist types on my podcast, Matt Ridley and Bjorn Lomborg and Haidt and Pinker, more distantly, but more recently, Lomborg and Ridley and Marian Tupy, who's written a lovely book on human progress, 10 things everyone needs to know about human progress. It's something like that, huh? Anyways, one of the things we discussed consistently was the difficulty in promoting the message that all three of these men are very aware of, which is that from a material perspective, in terms of absolute privation, worldwide, humanity is way better off on virtually every dimension you could possibly measure than ever. And most of that improvement has occurred in the last 40 years, and it's been revolutionary in its speed. And no one knows this. And so it's very important to try to think through why that is. Like, that's such a positive message. Now, I talked to Russell Brand about this, and I'm bringing him up for a reason. He's a lefty by temperament and by heart. And his first objection, but he's very thoughtful and quick. His first objection, I pointed out all this data showing that by every possible objective measure, everything is way better than it was certainly 100 years ago, but certainly even 20 years ago, even on the environmental front in the main. And he said, well, what about disparity of distribution? So there's the problem of absolute level of wealth, let's say. That's improving. But there is still tremendous disparity. And of course, that is fair enough. You could even point out that the role of the left is to provide a conscientious voice for that's constantly attending to the fact of continuing disparity regardless of absolute level of wealth. And fair enough. But having said all that, it's a great mystery that incremental optimism is not sufficiently motivating. And you can't just wish human nature is going to change. It's not going to change. We got to tell a better story. And I also think that's why I'm a target, I think, is because I am actually trying to tell a better story and I'm actually having some success with it.
Rule number 7, have faith.
I think faith is a form of courage. If you're hurt by life, and you will be, it's understandable that you might react in a nihilistic and hopeless fashion and become anxious and depressed and cynical and bitter and all of that. That's a bad pathway. And I think part of what helps you through that is faith. And part of that faith is that it's incumbent upon you, and actually in your best interest and everyone else's, to maintain faith in the fundamental goodness of existence, including your own, despite the evidence to the contrary. Right? Because you can draw conclusions from suffering in two ways, right? One is that you have a duty and perhaps the capability to transcend the suffering and still serve the good, or you can derive the conclusion that life is so unbearable that it would be best terminated, which is the conclusion that Goethe's Mephistopheles derives, for example, in Faust. He says, well, the world is rife with suffering, and it's so unbearable that consciousness itself, all being, should cease to exist. That would be better. Nothing is better than something if something is rife with suffering. And you can derive that conclusion, and you'll be driven to it in some of the farther reaches of your life when terrible things happen to you. But I would say faith is the courage to not take that path despite the evidence that that might be justified. And so I think it is a form of courage in the highest sense. And I also think it is a redeeming form of courage. One of the things I told my daughter, who was very, very ill for a very long period of time and in tremendous pain and suffering the high probability of continued slow, painful, inevitable degeneration, was do not let your illness, do not take advantage of your illness as an excuse. And I told her that when she was in grade 2. You know, it's no joke to tell someone that, because I knew she'd had every reason to be embittered. But I also knew that if she was, in combination with her illness, the two things might be worse than fatal. And, you know, if you don't think there are things that are worse than fatal, you have not suffered, because there are things that are much worse than fatal. And there's certainly not something you want to doom your child to.
Rule number 8, take responsibility.
So one of the things I've been talking to my audiences about is the relationship between responsibility and meaning, which is, what would you say? It's a constant refrain in the book. It's one of its underlying messages, let's say, or themes is a better way of thinking about it. You know, if you start with the presumption that there's a baseline of suffering in life and that can be exaggerated as a consequence of human failing, as a consequence of malevolence and betrayal and self-betrayal and deceit and all those things that we do to each other and ourselves that we know that aren't good, that amplifies the suffering. That's sort of the baseline against which you have to work. And it's contemplation of that often that makes people hopeless and depressed and anxious and overwhelmed and all of that, and they have the reasons. But you need something to put up against that. And what you put up against that is meaning. Meaning is actually the instinct that helps you guide yourself through that catastrophe. And most of that meaning is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. So if you think, for example, if you think about the people that you admire, well, you think about when you have a clear conscience first, because that's a good thing to aim at, which is something different than happiness, right?
A clear conscience is different than happiness.
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah.
That's
you're not
better.
Like guilting yourself. You're not feeling bad about yourself.
That's right. You feel that you've justified your existence, right? And so you're not waking up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat thinking about all the terrible things that you've involved yourself in.
What you said to someone that you shouldn't have said, or how you acted, or lied,
or what
or
opportunity you lost, or the things that you've let go that you should have capitalized on, and all of that. And so, if you think about the times when you're at peace with yourself with regards to how you're conducting yourself in the world, it's almost always conditions under which you've adopted responsibility, right? At least the most guilt I think that you can experience, perhaps, is the sure knowledge that you're not even taking care of yourself, so that you're leaving that responsibility to other people, because that's pretty pathetic. And unless you're psychopathic and you're living a parasitical life, and that characterizes a very small minority of people, and an even smaller minority think that's justifiable. But most of the time you're in guilt and shame because not only are you not taking care of yourself, let's say, so someone else has to, but you're not living up to your full potential. And so there's an existential weight that goes along with that.
Rule number 9, validate your perceptions.
I came about the ideas that I'm going to relate to you by a variety of routes. Conducting investigations in a variety of disciplines. Scientific disciplines, to the degree I was capable of doing that. And inquiries into literary reality, because literature has its reality. I mean, not only its existence as literature, which is obviously real, but in what it portrays, which is very interesting because we all know that literary portrayals are fictional, and we all know that fiction isn't true. But we all know that literature is true, and deep literature is particularly true, and so that seems to pose somewhat of a problem. I came to the ideas that I'm discussing too because I noted the emergence of a problem across multiple disciplines, and it's a very serious problem. In fact, I would say it's a problem so serious that it took 3.5 billion years of evolution to solve. And that would be the problem of perception. You know, the world is given to us in our perceptions, and we confuse the world that we perceive with the actual world, and we have to because we're stuck with our limited and ignorant perceptions. And so it's necessarily the case that we bump up hard against the underlying reality that those perceptions are trying to represent. I read a paper in the MIT Handbook of Cognitive Science a while back. It wasn't the first place I'd encountered this idea, but it was stated pretty briefly, and so it's a good way of laying out the problem. The problem is really one of interpretation, and it bedeviled artificial intelligence researchers who were attempting to produce functional robots that could operate in real-world environments. And you'll note we have none of those yet, although we are getting much closer. It bedeviled cognitive scientists and psychophysiologists who were trying to understand visual perception, which turns out to be complicated beyond comprehension. I mean, we devote about half our brain, it's really more than that, to just seeing. And it's interesting to contemplate why that might be if the world, in some sense, is given and composed of self-evidently apprehensible objects, which it's not at all. And the problem also emerged in literary criticism, and interestingly enough, its emergence there sparked, I would say, the culture war that we're all engaged in at the moment. And so this is not a trivial problem. And the MIT researchers that I described, Medin and Aguilar, said, it is possible to categorize a finite number of objects in an infinite number of ways. And you think, well, that doesn't sound like too serious a problem. But it's actually a really serious problem because it means that any snapshot of reality, let's say any visual snapshot of reality, certainly any conceptual snapshot of reality, like a book, is subject to an unending number of potential interpretations. And we could perhaps quibble about whether that's actually infinite, but I don't think that's really matters. There's all sorts of mathematical discussions about the true nature of infinity, and that's not the point. The point is there are lots of them, way more than you could ever sort through. And so how do you do it? And how do you do it in such a in a manner that really makes it simple in some sense? Because there's the step, and there it is, and I walk down it, and no problem, except, like I said, it took 3.5 billion years to evolve the platform that made that perception possible. And so if it took God himself, 3.5 billion years to manage it, then it's a rather difficult problem to solve. So I started studying cybernetics, neuropsychology, animal behaviorism, literary theory, psychoanalytic theory, existential philosophy, biblical studies, physics to a limited degree, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, measurement theory, construct validation theory, all these different diverse domains of inquiry, trying to triangulate this problem, although more than triangulate, because I was using more than one reference point. It's a good method by which to proceed. If you can find an answer that manifests itself in multiple historically detached disciplines simultaneously, it's some evidence that that idea is valid. You do that with your senses. You have 5 senses. If all 5 senses, which are quite qualitatively distinct, point to the same thing, then you can be reasonably but not certainly sure that it's there. By reasonably but not certainly, I mean, if that was all there was to specifying the objects of perception properly, we wouldn't have to talk to each other and find out what other people think. But we do, because even with that quintangulation, let's say, we still orient ourselves unreliably in the world.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is prioritize attention.
What I think is at the core of the postmodern critique. I don't think you can look at the world except through a structure of value. And the English, and so you think, well, why is literary criticism so relevant? Well, or become so relevant and so powerful? And I think, well, I believe that we see the world through a narrative framework. And so that, if that's true, and we could talk a little bit about that, what I mean by that, I think you need a mechanism to prioritize your attention. Because attention is a finite resource and it's costly, so you have to prioritize it. And there's no difference between prioritizing your attention and imposing a value structure. Those are the same thing. And then I think that the mechanisms that we use to prioritize our attention are stories. And that means that the people who criticize our stories actually have way more power than you think, because they're actually criticizing the mechanism through which we look at the world. And so the postmodernists would say, look, you even look at the scientific world through a value-laden lens. And I think, yeah, you do. They're right. But what they're not right about is that the lens is one of power. And now, for someone like Nietzsche, the thing about a word like power is you can expand the thing, the borders of the word, to encompass virtually any phenomena you want. And so that's why I tried to define power as my willingness to use compulsion on you or other people. Because power can be authority, power can be competence. I don't mean any of that. I mean, you don't get to do what you want. Coercion. I get to tell you. Coercion, exactly. And I do think the Marxist types view the willingness to use coercion as the driving force of human history. And that's really saying something, because that means it's the fundamental motivation. And that's a very caustic criticism. And it's easy to put people back on their heels about that. You know, one of the things you see about capitalists, because I've been stunned to see the CEOs of major corporations like roll over in front of these DEI activists. I think, well, what the hell's wrong with you people? You know, you're not even making use of your privilege. And why are you, well, it's not very powerful if you're the CEO of a major corporation. You can't even withstand some interns who have DEI ideology. It's like, it's doing you a lot of good. And and why would you produce a 5th column within your organization that's completely opposed to the entire manner in which you do business and the capitalist enterprise as such? And one answer would be, well, we don't think much about ideas. It's like, well, maybe you should. And you know, you can be cynical about it and say, well, it's just a gloss to keep the capitalist enterprise going while appearing to meet, you know, the new demands of the new ethical reality, which I think is a bad argument too. But more importantly, it's that people are guilty. And the radicals who accuse us all, historically and as individuals, of being motivated by nothing but the desire for power, strike a chord, especially in people who are conscientious, you know, because if you're a conscientious person and someone comes to you and says, like a little mob of 30 people says, you know, you could be a little more careful in what you say and do on the racist front and the sexist front, etc., you're likely to think, well, I'm not perfect. I probably could be a little more careful, and it's no doubt that people have been oppressed in the past, and it's also no doubt that in some sense I'm the undeserving beneficiary of historical atrocity, and so, you know, maybe I should look to myself, and that's weaponization of guilt, and it's very effective, and it's not surprising, but it's not helpful. So, you know, so there's a resentment that drives this, like a corrosive resentment that's able to weaponize guilt, and it's very difficult for people to withstand it. Part of the cultural battle that we all find ourselves enveloped in is partially due to the claim that there's virtually nothing other than the lust for power. And, you know, I would say, fair enough, in some limited sense, and that's that bears directly on your question, because you see that as a temptation that might be powerful enough to bend and distort you as you attempt to make your way through, let's say, the halls of power. Well, I heard recently from a reliable source that Putin's conversion to Orthodox Christianity might be genuine. And then you might think, well, if you're atheistic, well, that's not necessarily a good thing, or maybe you think it's a bad thing, or maybe you think it's an irrelevant issue, and you may also think it's a lie. But I would say that I would be more inclined to trust someone who thinks there's something higher than himself. And then you might say, well, what is it that's higher than ourselves? And that's worth thinking about. And we all need to think about this, regardless of the particulars of our religious belief. And I would say, again, from a clinical perspective, service to others is really something. People who are depressed tend to use the pronouns I and me much more frequently than people who aren't depressed. And I'm not saying that people get depressed because they're selfish. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that one of the routes out of depression appears to be an increase in service to other people. And I think the reason for that is because we aren't power-mad demons at the core, even though we may be tempted by such things, and that we find the genuine meaning that offsets genuine suffering in the genuine service to others. And I think it's a big mistake to be cynical, especially prematurely, about such things as political activity, because they're necessary, despite, let's say, their adversarial and party-centered nature, partisan nature. You have to be clear about what you serve and why. And that has to be held higher always than mere victory, mere operationalized victory or instrumental victory. And it's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate, particularly because in the political realm, in some sense, you have to defeat your enemy, right? Because you have to win the election and the other people have to lose. It's a binary choice. But so often I see in partisan discussion the proclivity to assume that all the ill will and malevolence resides on the other side of the chamber. And that's a big mistake. And you could think about that more deeply too, is that we all need a place to place the existence of malevolence, right? Because malevolence clearly exists, and we all suffer from the weight of malevolent history, right? Because even the grounds we walk on here, which this is a remarkable and wonderful place, I mean, English soil is soaked with blood, just like the soil of every place in the world. That's part of the human heritage, and all of us bear the marks of that conflict in some sense in our souls, partly because of the possibility for us to engage in that, but also partly because part of the reason we're here in all this privilege is because of all that catastrophe. Well, the best way to localize that malevolence is inside you, right? And to remember that the enemy that you're fighting with, the greatest enemy that you ever fight with, is in your own heart. And that'll also stop you from confusing that true source of malevolence, let's say, with your mere political enemies. And that isn't to say that you won't encounter malevolent behavior, although most of it in the political sphere, as it is everywhere, most of it is more ignorance than malevolence, although willful blindness certainly plays a large role. And so you need to know what it is that you're serving. And I would say one of the ways to do that practically, or a couple of ways to do that practically, is you need a good team around you, the people you really trust and who can watch you, and who do it with a certain degree of impartiality, and who are disagreeable enough to talk to you when you do something wrong. So you need trusted advisors. And then the other thing I would say is you really need to listen to your constituents, because they will tell you what the problems are if you listen to them. And if you really listen to them, well, then you'll have your feet on the ground, which is where they should be, and you'll know what the problems are, and you will win elections. Because what people really want from their leaders is to be listened to, and then for those leaders to articulate what they've heard in the halls of, let's say, influence and power. And so if you know those things, if you know you need to listen, you need to get in touch with the people you're representing as regularly as you possibly can, and mostly to listen. I knew a man in Canada who started a political party which is a very difficult thing to do. And not only did he start it, but he rode it to sufficient success so that he became the leader of the opposition in Canada within about 10 years. And I asked him how he did that, because it's like, well, really, how did you do that? That's actually really hard. And he said he would go out from constituency to constituency and make his stump speeches, but what he really liked was the Q&As, because people would tell him what their problems were. Then he knew what the problems were. And out of the dialogue would also emerge the answers that the audience found compelling. And so not only would they tell him what the problems were, but they would tell him the answers they would like to have what instituted to solve those problems. It's the same thing that comedians do when they finesse their acts in front of live audiences before they practice them in front of a large audience. They tell jokes, and the audience either laughs or they don't. And if they laugh, then you keep that joke, and if they don't, you throw it out. And soon you're just as funny as the audience can possibly manage. And it's the same thing. You can also do that in a dark manner, by the way, which is what Hitler did. So he could utter terrible things and wait for a response and collect those. And so then you become the embodiment of the shadow of your people. So I would recommend that you probably don't do that. I don't know how many of you have read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, but I would highly recommend that in Crime and Punishment, the protagonist commits the perfect murder. And he has his reasons for it, and many reasons, because Dostoevsky didn't mess around. When he wanted to give someone reasons, he gave them reasons. And Raskolnikov, the main character, had reasons for murder. And then he commits his murder, and he gets away with it. But things don't go well for Raskolnikov, because one of the things he finds out is that the Raskolnikov that you were before you committed the murder is not the same as the Raskolnikov as you are after you've committed the murder. And there's a dividing line there that you don't. It's like the red pill, I guess, right? It's that's the Matrix, correct? The red pill. And once there's certain actions, once you take them, there's no going back. And so that's what Crime and Punishment is about. And Raskolnikov tortures himself to death, well, not literally, but metaphysically, psychologically, because he cannot tolerate breaking the great moral code. And so it's a great book. It's truly a great book, and it's also extraordinarily, like it's a murder mystery thriller as well as being a deep philosophical book. So if you're in the mood for a murder mystery thriller that's also a deep philosophical book, then that's the one for you.
You speak about the concept of the soul. Do you associate this with any psychological constructs?
Not any psychological constructs that are more valid than the notion of the soul. No, there's, I would say, what we mean by soul is something like animating spirit. And you might say, well, what's a spirit? And well, that's actually rather easy to answer. So when a child of 4 is playing house, let's say when a child of 4 is playing house, she acts out the role of the mother. But acting out, that's a strange thing, right? Because she doesn't literally duplicate in her actions or her perceptions in the game what she observed her mother literally doing. So, for example, she didn't go into her mother's bedroom when her mother awoke and watched her turn her head in a particular way to awaken and count the number of blinks so that she could mimic that in her play. And, you think that's absurd, but it's not absurd if it's just mimicry. It's not. It's unbelievably sophisticated. So what the girl does is she watches her mother manifest maternal behavior across a vast array of instances, and she integrates that with the image of the mother she's received from all the books she's been read and all the little movies she's watched, the Disney movies and so forth, and she abstracts out the animating principle of the maternal, and then she embodies that in play, and usually with a little boy, and that's practice for what's going to come later. It's unbelievably sophisticated, and she's embodying a spirit, and the spirit there is the abstraction of the central animating principle from multiple embodiments of its manifestation. And if you think children can't do that, well, then you don't know anything about children, because they do that all the time in their pretend play, which is a necessary precursor to healthy psychological development. And so part of what we refer to as the soul is the presence of that spirit, or maybe even the capacity of embodying such spirits. And it's very difficult to know how deep that goes. You know, I had a vision at one point of all the men in my life who've been particularly influential in a benevolent way. You know, and you think, well, just the mere notion of the idea that there could be a benevolent way that would unite the acts of benevolence across a series of men, that's all comprehensible to you. You take that as a matter of course when you say that there are such things as good men and you can identify them, right? Something stable about whatever is good across multiple manifestations of incarnation, let's say. And I saw that transform into the Father person of the Trinity as the embodiment of that benevolent spirit. Now, I don't have any idea what that means metaphysically, because who does? But that spirit manifesting itself within is certainly part of what we refer to when we talk about the soul. And you can see that shine through people. I mean, it's part of what gives someone charisma. It's part of what elicits the instinct to imitate in you. You know, and you see that even in simple things. When you see a remarkable athlete do something incredibly athletic to put the soccer ball, the football ball through the net, to score the goal, and everybody leaps to their feet in celebration of that, well, that's a celebration of the divine capacity to hit the target dead on. And it grips you at such a low level, way down inside your soul, that you're compelled to your feet to cheer, and you don't even know what you're doing. But you enjoy it, that's for sure. And that enjoyment is also a sign of the depth and utility of that response. You see this in all the things that people do that are, you know, so-called popular entertainment. It's unbelievably sophisticated. The soul is participating in that in the fullest extent. And, you know, you can say, well, there's no necessary use for the religious terminology. It's like, well, until you come up with a better word, there's plenty of use for it, because it's a very complex and deep phenomena. And to, you know, just cast it into the realm of superstition in some casual manner it's just not helpful. Not in any possible. It's not helpful scientifically. It's not helpful ethically. It's not helpful existentially. Try treating someone for a while as if they don't have a soul. Just really, I mean it. Just, you know, treat them like a deterministic machine, if that's your belief. Really act it out. You'll be like the most hated person in town in about 15 minutes. Well, I mean, what do you make of practical evidence like that? I mean, you interact with people as if they're free souls capable of choosing between good and evil. That's what you do all the time. And maybe you can addle yourself out of that by some ridiculous rationalist ideology, but that just means you're kind of a gabbling fool, and it's just going to make you trip over things you don't even notice in all of your social interactions. And you tell me, I don't care how you think philosophically or ideologically, you bloody well know that what I just said is true. So, and that's true even when you're interacting with an infant or a small child. It's true when you're dealing with someone who's elderly and virtually incapacitated in every way. You still see that divine spark, for lack of a better term, and we do lack a better term, by the way. You see that everywhere if your eyes are open and if you're willing to see it, and to the degree that you're responsive to that, then your actions are guided by love and your words are guided by truth.
You need that instinct for meaning too. So, and we should get this real straight. Why do you need it? Well, you need it because life is really, really difficult, right? I mean, people have a rough time of it. There's plenty of suffering in life, and everyone is going to encounter it, right? You learn this as a clinical psychologist, and you know this generally, you know, unless you're an extraordinarily fortunate person. You don't have to talk to someone for very long and really talk to them and get beneath the surface until you find, you know, there's a tragedy or two or three or 10 lurking not very far beneath the surface. Someone in the family is very ill. There's a childhood history of extreme pathology, alcoholism somewhere in the family, maybe a touch of insanity. Someone has cancer, you know, an older relative is dying. There's financial trouble. There's economic trouble. There's marital trouble. It's like life is trouble. And now, you know, that doesn't mean it's all trouble, but man, it's trouble. And sometimes it's a lot of trouble. And sometimes it's so much trouble that you you can barely stand it. And you see that because people get depressed and they commit suicide. And the reason they do that is because they think not being is better than being. And that's quite the decision, So, and it's not that uncommon among people who are depressed. And so it's a very important thing to consider. And it isn't just a matter of depression and suicide. That's bad enough. But, if you're unhappy because your suffering has pushed you past the point of your ability to cope, then there's all sorts of other things that can happen to you that aren't directed towards you. You can become cynical, and you can become bitter, and you can become cruel, and you can become narcissistic and deceitful and arrogant. And it's like everything's for you. And then you're out for revenge. That's a nice one. I don't know against who, but maybe everyone. Maybe even including you, because you're not happy about the role you've played in generating your own misery. I mean, there's a lot of darkness underneath the suffering. And so, and that's an ever-present existential danger for human beings, We're aware of the future, we're aware of our fragility, we're aware of our mortality. It's something that makes us truly unique, truly conscious in a way that no other creature is, and capable of things that no other creature can do, but also bearing an unbelievably heavy existential load. We're the only creatures that have to always contend with the fact that we're finite and that everyone we know is in the same position, that allied with the suffering. And so that's there all the time. And even in the brightest moments, in some sense, in Renaissance paintings, in still lifes, they used to put a memento mori often in the still life, like a skull somewhere in the corner, or sometimes in a very strange perspective, so that you could only see the skull if you were standing like right beside the painting instead of dead on. But the idea was to always remember, that everything that exists is tainted or touched with the taint of mortality. And that's rough, but there's some useful things in it. It keeps you awake and it keeps you focused if you're careful. But it also does indicate to you, if you think about it, the necessity of having a meaning in your life. Because if it's true intrinsically that life has this unbearable element of suffering, which seems to be completely in what would you say, indisputable as far as I'm concerned, and it's worse than that too, because it's not just suffering, it's suffering contaminated with malevolence, right? It's bad enough to have something bad happen to you, and it's likely that that'll happen, but it's even worse for you to do it to yourself and to know that you did it. That's rough. And it's also extraordinarily rough to be betrayed by someone else, or tyrannized by your own culture. And that's not just suffering, that's like unnecessary and pointless suffering that's been directed at you by something that wants that to happen. And so both of those are very, very powerful, let's say, archetypal forces, suffering and malevolence, and we have to deal with them at every level of reality. And you need something to push back against that. It's not optional, if that's the default position, and I think it's the default position. Like, a meaningless life isn't meaningless. It's suffering and malevolence. That's not good. And if that's acted out, that's the other thing. If that's acted out, and I've read the accounts and the actions of people who've taken a very vicious turn into the darkest parts of the underworld, consequence of their resentment and their malevolence, and then their desire to make everything in the world suffer for the outrage of its existence, man. I mean, that's how we turn things into hell. If you want to know why totalitarian states take the brutal twists they take, and why people are motivated to do the absolutely terrible things that they do, well, that's why, is that the suffering and the malevolence that's intrinsic to life overwhelms them, and they turn in a very bad direction, and then they make everything that's already bad way worse, and we're very, very inventive at such things. And so that's not good, unless that's the path you want. That's a bad idea. You need an alternative, and that's meaning.
So then you could imagine, I have this cottage in Northern Ontario, and we're fortunate. It's dark there, and so you can go down to the dock at night, and in the clear sky, you can see the vast array of the infinite heavens arrayed above you, and it's something that people who live in cities really don't get to experience anymore. They don't experience the sunset, which we also go out on our boat and watch pretty much every day. And that puts you in touch with what inspires awe. And that's not a propositional experience, that's a pre-propositional experience, and it's a deep biological experience. It's embedded in the prey response to a predator in part, because if you feel awe, sometimes you can feel that with music. A lot of people who are high in openness to experience will feel that quite frequently under the effect of aesthetic experiences, interestingly enough. Their hair stands on end. That's piloerection. That's what a cat does when it's frightened by a dog, like the little boy at the beginning of the story. The cat puffs up to look big, to be like meta cat, so that it can contend with dogs, or at least it can look like it might. And so when it sees a dog, the sight of the dog calls the best forth out of the cat. Well, that's what happens when you look at the night sky. It calls to you, right? Dr. Dawkins sent me a paper last week in preparation for a discussion that we're going to have tomorrow. And it was a very interesting paper, and I think I read it about 25 years ago, and he said, any functioning animal has to be a microcosm, a model of the environment within which it finds itself. Well, that's true of us. And so when you look at the night sky and that sense of awe grips you and calls something out of you, right, to respond to your encounter with the infinite, even your encounter with mortality, your encounter with finitude and limitation, all of that in relationship to the infinite. That sense of awe is also the calling forth of something out of you that can respond to the challenge of that infinite. Well, that's the microcosm within. It's a reflection of the structure of the cosmos itself. That's the divine ideal. And we either imitate that, or we fail to imitate that, or we pursue the opposite path. Those are the options, and it's given our technological power and our capacity for wholesale atrocity, it's time we woke up and realized it.
You have to make a decision in your life, and this is a decision, and I would say that it's a voluntary element of faith, because it isn't exactly evidence-based. It's more like something you decide before you even look at the evidence. It's more like you decide to stake your life on this. Like, if you decide to get married to someone, you don't really do it on the basis of the evidence that you're going to have a happy life, because you don't have that evidence. You do it. You decide that you're going to make a happy life with this person and that it's worth the risk. So you get married as an expression of faith. Okay. And so faith doesn't mean believing things that no one with any sense would believe. Faith sometimes means putting a stake in the sand and saying, here's where I stand in some sense, regardless. And you do that when you get married. You do that maybe when you pledge allegiance to a friend. You have a best friend and you want to maintain that friendship as long as you possibly can. It's a decision of faith. Maybe you do that when you decide a career, when you go to university, because you could have done something else, right? But you chose that. So that's where you put your faith. And like I said, that doesn't mean believing what no reasonable person would believe. Okay, so back to God is love. Well, I'm going to talk about being first instead of God. And being is the totality of experience. That we're going to define it that way for the purposes of this discussion. Being is what there is instead of nothing. And you experience that as a conscious creature. Being is what you experience as a conscious creature. It includes all your emotions, all your motivations, all your subjective experience, as well as everything that's objective. Okay, so it seems to me that all things considered, it's a useful move of faith to act as if you love being. And if you love something, then you want the best in it to flourish. And so maybe you decide deep in your soul that it would be better for you to act towards an end that makes everything that's good better. That's the best way to live, to make everything that's good better. And maybe to restrict the development of everything that's malevolent and evil within yourself and in the broader world, insofar as you're able to do that. And so I think that's an expression of love, is that because when you love something, you care for it. And the proper attitude towards being,
I think, is care. And so that's one element of God is love. God being analogous in some way to being. Now, we could look at God more classically as the creator of being. If you assume being is good, well, it's not much of a leap to assume the creator of being is good. And maybe you adopt an attitude towards the creator of being, and that's also love. And you open your heart to existence. And maybe that's the most effective means of having existence open its heart to you. So, for example, if you love other people, you want the best for them, you want the best in you to serve the best in them. If you love them and you trust them courageously, so you open yourself up to them, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that that's how you elicit the best from them, the best that can be elicited. You're going to get hurt sometimes and betrayed, but that's going to happen no matter what approach you take. I think that's the most effective approach. And that is perhaps the most effective approach to existence per se, to approach it with love and courage. And so that's how that looks to me. Is it a feeling like loving a person? Yes, I think it is. I think it is a feeling like loving a person. It's the generalization of that care that you would have for a child, your brother, your sister, a family member. It's the generalization of that to the broader domain of existence, to broader domains of existence. And I think that's a skill in some sense, right? I mean, if you're good at loving and caring for your family, but you can expand that outward so that more people are brought under that umbrella, then, well, assuming you can manage that, it's very difficult. It seems to me that that's laudable. It seems to me that we spontaneously admire and would like to imitate people who are capable of that. And so you see that when you have a job or you encounter a boss who takes you under his or her wing and helps develop you, or you find a teacher who's particularly inspiring, or you work for an entrepreneur who's inspiring and who also opens doors for you. They're acting with love as far as I'm concerned. They want the best in them to serve the best in you. And that's very, very motivating for everyone. And that's the proper basis of our social relationships, not power, for God's sake. So, can love balance out the crushing responsibility? That's a sophisticated question. I don't know the answer to that. Love is warmer than responsibility. Love is part of empathy and agreeableness. It's a different dimension than responsibility, which is more part of conscientiousness and sort of a cold virtue. I don't know if it balances out the crushing responsibility, but I think it's the emotional analog to the crushing responsibility, right? So maybe there's love and duty, and they run parallel in if you're an ethical person. That's not all there is to ethics, but love and duty, they're important, and maybe they're better together than they would be as independent entities.
Your perceptual structures are determined by the goals that you have at hand. I mean, some of that's not completely true, because your perceptual systems also have limitations, right? There's things you can't see or hear even if you need to. So there are limitations built in, but within that set of limitations, you're still trying to tune your perceptions to your motivated goals. And that's also very useful to think about when you're trying to understand artificial intelligence, because for human beings, without goals, there's no perception. Because there's no filtering mechanism that you can use to determine the level of resolution at which you perceive. Anyway, so there's a thing made of smaller things which are made out of smaller things. And it's kind of my iconic representation of the complexity of the world. And then you could think, well, what is this? How can you see this object? And I think if you just look at it, you can detect, it's like a Necker cube, those cubes that are line drawings that you can see the front of, and then it'll flip to the back. Have you seen those? So this is kind of Necker cube-like, or at least it is for me, in that when I look at it, my perceptions play around with it. Sometimes I focus on the kind of cross-like shape in the middle, and sometimes I can see these other lines, and then sometimes I'll focus on that square, and sometimes I can see the little dots there, or maybe one dot, and my perceptions are going like this, trying to fit a pattern to it. And you can kind of detect that when you're watching it. And so I would say, well, you have the options of perceiving this in its full complexity, or you can simplify it, essentially there's lots of ways you can simplify it, but some of them are laid out there. So you take the complex thing, you make a low resolution representation of it. So that's the rough area that all those dots occupy. That's the rough area broken down to its 4 most fundamental quadrants. That might be how you would look at it if this was a map of an orchard and you were trying to walk from south to north. That would be a useful representation. This combines this and this. That's that's the highest level of resolution that you can perceive this object at. That's lower resolution than the object itself. So the first issue is, how should you look at things? Well, that's a problem that intelligence has to solve. So that's one of the problems that intelligence goes after. And then I think what happens is we have the thing in itself, and then we simplify it with a perception, and that's like an iconic representation, and then we nail the iconic representation with a word. And that's how we compress the world's complexity into something that we can manage. We take the complex thing, make it into an icon, and represent the icon with a word. And then when I throw you the word, so to speak, you decompose it into the icon and then decompose it even further into the thing if you know the icon and you know the thing. And so then we can use shorthand, right? Because you have representational structures and so do I, and I'm just tossing you markers about your representational structures and you can unfold them. That's what you do when you're reading a novel. Because the novel comes alive in your imagination in your own idiosyncratic way. And it wouldn't if you didn't understand the references of the novel, right? The novelist has to assume that your basic perceptual structures and your intuitions and your instincts are basically the same as his or hers. Because otherwise they have to assume that, because otherwise they would be lost in an infinite regressive explanation. So, and it's problematic often. For example, if you start reading Victorian novels, you may find that it takes a while to get into them because the presuppositions, the expectations are slightly different, and so is the language. You have to update the representations.
There's so many rules that are great, but what do you think is probably, if somebody was to read those books and there's one rule that you're like, this rule out of the 24 I've given you over these past few years, you can absolutely not get this one wrong. Which rule would that be?
Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Because you can't tell the truth, right? Because who are you to tell the truth? That's a mighty tall order, man. But you can stop saying things that you know are lies. And that will change your life if you do that. And it's crucial.
Why would it change their life?
Well, how can you adapt to reality when you falsify it? And you think, well, I'm just lying to other people. No, you're not. You can't just lie to other people because what you say becomes you, especially if you practice it, because we build ourselves out of words. And that can be lies in action too. It's like, don't say things you know to be false. That's a good start, man. And it aligns yourself with the truth. And like, how can that be a bad idea? Imagine that what is true reflects reality, which is sort of the definition of true. How can failing to align yourself with reality work? How is that possibly going to work? Well, you say, well, I can, if I lie, I get away with something. It's like, no, you don't. I tell you, I swear this is true. In all of my clinical practice, I have never, ever seen anyone ever get away with anything even once. You think the chickens won't come home to roost. It's like, all that means is you're too stupid to see what your lies caused, or too blind or too self-deceptive. You just don't see it. And so you don't get away with anything, nothing. It's terrifying to actually understand that. It's terrifying. What if you can't get away with anything, ever? Well, that's the judgmental God, fundamentally. That's a very old idea, and it's an old idea for a reason. And of course you can't get away with anything, because imagine that you took a flexible plastic comb, and you bent it backwards, and you say, well, I got away with that. It's like, well, what's going to happen when you let go? It's going to snap back and hit you in the face, and that's life, man. You warp the structure of reality? You think you are someone who can warp the structure of reality with your words and get away with it? Really? No, man, that should terrify you right to the core of your soul. You're not God. Treat yourself like you're someone that you care about. See, I read this piece of work by Jung a long while back, and it was a meditation on the injunction to treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated, something like that. And what Jung pointed out, which I really liked, was that wasn't an injunction to be nice to other people. It was an invitation to reciprocity. It was something like this. It's like, you should figure out how you would like to be treated, like you were taking care of yourself, not how you would like people to respond to you. It's more important than that. It's like, imagine you had a child that you really cared for, and someone said, well, people will treat this child exactly like you want them to, but you have to figure out what that is. And so then you'd have to sit down for like a month and you'd think, okay, well, how do you want your child to be treated? You don't want everyone just to be nice to him, you know, you want people to challenge him, and you want people to discipline him, and you want people to tell him when he's wrong. It's like, you don't just want everyone to be nice. That's pathetic. It's pathetic. There's no challenge in that. And so, well, you want to treat other people like you would like to be treated. Well, then you have to figure out, how would you like to be treated? And while you'd like people to fawn all over you and just lay everything at your feet, it's like, no, that's not something you'd wish for someone that you were taking care of. And then there's an additional problem, which is, it's often the case that people will treat other people better than they treat themselves. That happens extremely frequently. So one of the things I pointed out in chapter 2 was that if you have a dog and you take him to a vet and the vet gives you the prescription medicine, you'll go buy the medicine and you will give it to the dog and you will do it properly. But if you go yourself to a doctor and you get a prescription, there's a 30% chance you won't even pick up the medication. And if you do, there's a 50% chance that you won't administer it to yourself properly. And so I really thought about that. When I first came across that statistic, it was another one of those little facts. I thought, what the hell's up with that? It's like, you'll do it for your dog, so obviously you'll do it for something you care about, and you're conscientious enough so you'll actually do it. So like, why wouldn't you do it for you? Your dog likes you, you know, even your dog would rather that you did, but you don't. And it's actually one of the reasons that modern medicine doesn't work nearly as well as it could, because people just don't take their medication. You make the world a much better place, much worse place, if you don't take care of yourself. So you should bloody well take care of yourself, you know, because, well, that's what the chapter's about. It's partly because you have something valuable to bring into the world. That's the thing about being an individual. It's the thing that Western civilization has always recognized, that as an individual, you have a light that you have to bring into the world, and that if you don't bring it into the world is a dimmer place. And that's a bad thing, because when the world is a dim place, it can get very, very, very dark. And so it's necessary, not just so that you feel better, not just so that you're a #1 lobster, none of those things. You need to take care of yourself because you're in the best position to do that. And it's necessary for you to take care of yourself. Despite the fact that we're mortal and vulnerable and self-conscious and capable, not only capable of doing terrible things, but actually do them. Despite all that, you still have that responsibility.
Most of your sanity is socially distributed. And what I mean by that is, well, let's say that you know how to behave. You're well socialized. You can play with others. Now, I said already in this conversation, if you didn't learn to play with others between the time you were 2 and 4, you will never learn. And psychologists have beat their heads against the wall trying to rehabilitate antisocial children. They can't do it after the age of 4.
Is that because areas of the brain just don't develop?
Well, it seems to be partly because the kids fall farther and farther behind. So let's say you make the leap from egocentric dependence on your mother at 2 and 3 to immersion in a peer group. Well, then you pick peers that are at your same developmental level, and you chase each other up the developmental ladder. And the longer you're out of that, the farther you fall behind. And so, you know, 5-year-old kids might come across another 5-year-old kid who tends to cry too much if they don't get their way. And they'll say, we don't want to play with the baby. And what they're saying is, we have to find someone who's at our developmental level, shares our developmental horizon, so that we can mutually scaffold our further development. Now, they're not going to say that, obviously, but that's the situation. And kids test each other out when they first meet. So do adults. Game. Can you play? Are you playing at the same level as me? I'm playing my game at the level that will further my development. Can you play along with me? If not, well, maybe you're lower in status and I can pull you up,
as a mentor. Maybe you're higher in status and I can learn from you, but if you're a peer, we can play together. Anyways, if you're acceptable to your peers and you behave well, they'll accept you. And then they tell you all the time if you're acting appropriately. You know, if your jokes are funny, if you're dominating the conversation, if you're bringing something of value to the table. And all you have to do is pay attention to the social cues and you'll keep yourself regulated.
All of the people that I know who have become successful in any way use a structured means to organize their time. They have lists of things to do. Like they have every day, there's a list of things to do that day. Every week, there's a list of things to do that week. Every month, there's a list of things to do that month. You know, at every level of temporal resolution, there's a sequence of plans, and those plans are implemented on a day-to-day basis. You cannot be, and successful isn't the right way of thinking about it, because I'm not thinking about, I'm not really thinking about rising up the corporate ladder. You know what I mean? And that's sort of what success has come to mean in our culture. That isn't what I mean. You can't have a life that you're going to find acceptable without that, because you need the vision and the plans to give you purpose and direction. That's where all your positive emotion comes from. All your motivation is laying out plans that are worth attaining and then observing yourself moving towards them. That's the source of most positive meaning. And then also, without that structure, you're so lost that you're going to be anxious and overwhelmed. It's really like being in a foreign country, like isolated and alone with no map. I don't know where the hell I am. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. The rains are going to come, the storms are going to come, and maybe it's winter, and I don't know where I am or where I'm going. You have to be very careful with your hierarchies because they tend towards inequality of distribution. That's one problem. Once they're established, they always also tend to a form of tyranny, because once a hierarchy of competence has been established, it can be invaded by people who use power as the means to attain status in the hierarchy. And that can corrupt and destroy even the entire hierarchy. So you have to be on guard for that. Plus, if your hierarchy becomes too steep in its distribution, so it's too tiny a fraction of people at the top and too great an agglomeration of people at the bottom, especially under conditions of genuine privation, then the people at the bottom it's not only unjust and unfair and producing excess suffering, but the people at the bottom have nothing to lose and might as well just flip the hierarchy on its end. And that's not a good way to produce a sustainable society. You don't want to put people in a position where they have nothing to lose, especially if you have something to lose, but also just with regards to principles of like fairness and justice, let's say. Don't recommend any changes that you wouldn't suffer for if they failed. How's that? And that's the problem with large-scale political action. It's like, well, here's how we should change things. It's like, well, they changed them. It's, well, it fails. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't hurt me. I'm not involved in it. It's like, you should be careful when you try to change things to make sure you suffer for your own stupidity.
Of course.
Head down endurance. And that'll get you through bad times, that endurance. It's such an underrepresented virtue, that ability to trudge forward unhappily under a unfairly burdensome load is a testament to character, if you can. And it's something that should be encouraged and valued. So, and I'm not making the claim that people who are depressed, who can't get out of bed, lack endurance. Some do and some don't, because depression comes in very varied degrees of intensity, and you can be laid out completely by depression. So I'm not trying to make some arbitrary judgment about who's got endurance and who hasn't. You can't do that from the outside, but I can say that endurance is one of the tools you have to deal with chronic discomfort and pain. And even if you have chronic pain, it's interesting because it's very much allied with depression, by the way. All of the research on chronic pain, back pain, for example, indicates, and chronic pain of all sorts, is that the more you allow your pain to render you inactive, the worse the outcome, including exacerbation of the pain.
And depression is a pain disorder. And so that's very much worth thinking about too. It's like, move forward, move forward, move forward. You know, and if you need to talk to somebody about what your plan is for the day or the hour or the week, then do that as well. And perhaps you also have to help get the people around you to help a bit. I need a little bit of help getting up in the morning. I need to have breakfast made for me so that all I do when I get up in my terrible state of fog and confusion and terrible anxiety and depression is I have a shower, because that's what happens first. And then the next thing is I eat. And then that's better. At least you're out of bed and moving, and that's a start, you know. So, and then you endure and hope, and that's how it is. And you do the same thing when someone in your family is sick or when you're facing a death. All of that. It's like one bloody foot in front of the other up the hill. I've had clients, many clients in their 30s, who are trying to. This is more true with women, I would say. A lot of women who are very high achieving and who established their career goals at 30 and then want to differentiate out their life. They want to have a husband, they want to have a family, they're trying to figure out how to do that. And one of the things I've noticed that around 30, you really have to stop comparing yourself in some ways to other people. And the reason for that is that the particularities of your life are so idiosyncratic that there isn't anyone really all that much like you, you know, because the details of your life happen to matter. And so maybe you compare yourself to some rock star or something like that, and you know, the person's rich and famous and glamorous and all that, but you know, they're alcoholic and they use too much cocaine and they've had 3 divorces, and it's like, how the hell do you make sense out of that? Is that someone that you should judge yourself harshly against or not? The answer is you don't know, because you don't know all the details of their lives. And who do you know that you can compare yourself to? That's easy. You. Yesterday. So here's a good goal. It's something like, well, aim high. And I really mean that. It's like, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. Aim high, but use as your control yourself. It's like, so your goal is to make today some tiny increment better than yesterday. And you can use better, you can define better yourself. This doesn't have to be some imposition of external morality. You know where you're weak and insufficient, where you could improve. You think, okay, well, this is what I'm like yesterday. If I did this little thing, things would be just an increment better. And well, that's a great thing, because you get the ball rolling, and incremental improvement is unstoppable. You can actually implement it, and it starts to generate Pareto distribution-like consequences. It starts to compound. And I've seen that happen in people's lives over and over. Well, people write me all the time and tell me that they're doing that, but I've seen that happen in people's lives continually. They make a goal that, and the goal should be, how could I conceive of my life so that if I had that life, it would clearly be worth living, so I wouldn't have to be bitter, resentful, deceitful, arrogant, and vengeful. You act out the things that you would do when you're normal, even when you're depressed. You know, you don't want to see people. Well, it doesn't matter. You go see them, because it's better than not seeing them. You know, and you find when you do see them that it's better, it'll go better than you think, but you can't isolate yourself. And you're anxious, and so you want to avoid. You don't want to go out. You'd rather stay home and sit in the chair and just sit there and like in a frozen position. It's like, you can't do that. You have to go out and go grocery shopping and go out and have coffee and all of those things. It doesn't matter whether you enjoy them. It matters that you do them, because that's what you do. That's what you do in order to maintain your health.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video, because you are awesome. For 10 more amazing rules from Russell Brand, check the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
None of your business, and therefore I shouldn't speculate, far less care as to what other people's opinions are. Self-pity is you hold on to something you don't want. You need the principle of acceptance to be free of self-pity.